Hello there, I'm Bart, and this is a recording of the first non-verbal reasoning online tutoring session on Nagwa Classes. Non-verbal reasoning is one of the 4 subjects commonly assessed in the 11 Plus exam and requires students to be able to spot patterns within images and apply these in various different scenarios. In this session, we discussed 3 out of the 6 different question types that commonly come up in the non-verbal reasoning exam. Please enjoy and subscribe to our channel for more content just like this. Hello. I can see some people have started to join. So I'd like to say welcome to all of you for joining the first session for the 11 Plus Non-Verbal Reasoning Nagwa Classes course. First of all, let's have a look at what this session is going to look like. So what I want to mention here is that we're going to be looking at 3 different question types that can be found in the non-verbal reasoning part of the 11 Plus exam. They're going to be called complete the sequence, complete the grid, and similar figures. And once we've had a look at these 3 different question types, we'll have a quick recap. So let's take a look at the first question type. There we go, complete the sequence. So this is what we're going to start with. In this particular question type, we're going to be given a sequence of 5 figures with 1 space left empty. What we need to do is to figure out which of the answer options that we're given fits into the missing space to complete the sequence. Seems pretty self-explanatory, and we'll see a few different variations of this. So in some cases, we'll see that one of the earlier boxes in our sequence of 5 has been left empty. In some cases, one of the later boxes will be left empty. And we need to try and figure out which of our answer options fits into the empty box. So let's take a look at what one of these questions looks like. Here is an example question. Now, what I'm going to do for this particular one, because we've never seen this question type before, is that I'm going to read it out, and then I'm going to give you some time to have a go at this question. So let's start by reading the question. What it says is, here are 5 squares arranged in order. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1 square has been left empty. We can see that this is the one that's been left empty. What we need to do is to select from the answer choices the correct figure that should take the place of this empty square to complete the sequence. So as we can see, we've got answer option A, B, C, D, and E. And we need to figure out which of these fits into this box here. So like I said, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to have a go at this one. And I'm actually going to leave a poll function as well. So you'll notice that your chat box will disappear, and you should be able to choose one of the answer options, A, B, C, D, or E. Please have a go and let me know what you think. And I will mention, because this is the first time we're seeing this kind of question, don't worry about getting it wrong. We'll talk through it. But I want you guys to have a go so that you can get used to the poll function, and you can also get used to this particular question type. Okay, so we've got a few answers coming in already, and a lot of you have said answer option C. So I'll write that down here. So thank you very much to those of you that have voted. Let's quickly talk through this question, because it looks like all of you have got the right answer. But it's worth looking at in a little bit more detail as well. So for this particular question, we can see that the sequence begins with a little gray square. And then the next box in the sequence has that same little gray square, but then a slightly larger rectangle that's also gray underneath it. Then we look at the missing square, which is exactly what we need to work out. But then we notice in the next square that there is the original little gray square and the rectangle that we saw. There's a new rectangular shape that's been added beneath, and then a 4th one here as well. And then the final shape, we see that there's 5. So it makes sense then that what we're looking for as the missing diagram is a little gray square. We've got that second rectangle and a third one beneath it. So for those of you that said answer option C, well done. That's exactly the one that we're looking for. So now that we are somewhat familiar with this kind of question, complete the sequence, we'll take a look at a couple more examples that get slightly harder as we go along. So here's what we're going to do. We'll take a look at another example question, which is this one. Once again, I'm going to turn your chat box into a poll. Have a go at this one. Oh, we've already got some answers coming in. So I'll leave a few more seconds for anybody else that wants to answer. Oh, we've got a few different answers. Excellent. So what I'm going to do is once I've disabled the poll and you're able to use the chat box again, if anybody feels brave and they want to actually leave a typed up message about how they think it's done, please do feel free to use the chat to do so. So for the moment, I'm seeing a few different answers of B, D, and E. I'm going to end the poll here. So yeah, please do feel free to use the chat box if you'd like to type up how you think this particular question is solved. And I'm going to talk through how it's done as well. So what we see here in the sequence is, once again, the middle one is missing, which means we need to figure out what goes in the middle box, which answer option. To start with, one thing we can notice is that every single one of the boxes that are filled, we can see has a hexagon. And this hexagon stays in the same orientation. The hexagon itself doesn't actually change which direction it's pointing in. However, we also have a gray circle within the hexagon that we can imagine as moving around inside the hexagon. In the first box, the gray circle touches the middle of this top side. In the second box, the gray circle touches the middle of this top right side. So it looks like what's happened is, from the first box to the second box, the circle has moved from here to here. That's why we see it here. So we can imagine that in the missing box, we'll also see a hexagon, white hexagon. But this time, if the circle is moving following the same pattern that we noticed from the first two boxes, we might expect it to end up here, touching the middle of this face, because it's moving clockwise around the inside of the hexagon. And we still want it to be a gray circle, because if we look at the next square, we look at the next box, we see that indeed it does follow that pattern. The circle's gone from here in the previous box, the middle of this face, to now touching the middle of the bottom edge of the hexagon. And then finally, it's gone from the middle of the bottom edge of the hexagon to touching the middle of the bottom left edge of the hexagon. So what we're looking for in our missing square then is one where we have a white hexagon and a gray circle touching the middle of the bottom right edge of the hexagon. And the one that best describes this is answer option E. So those of you that said E, well done. Let's quickly take a look at answer options B and D as well. Now, I can see exactly why you said B and D, but unfortunately, what happens in option B is that the gray circle actually touches two edges of the hexagon, which is not what we see in any of the other ones in the pattern. And similarly with answer option D, the circle is now touching two edges, or we can think of it as touching a corner of the hexagon. So although it would make sense on first glance for the circle to end up in either of our answer options B or D positions, what we're actually looking for is for the circle to be touching the middle of the bottom right edge. And so those of you that said answer option E, well done. What we're going to do now is to take a look at another question that has exactly the same wording up here. It's a complete the sequence question. And I'm going to get you all to once again have a go at answering it, and then we'll talk through the solution. So here is our next question. Remember, it's worth me mentioning, by the way, that this question wording is exactly the same as it was before, which is something that's worth noting about the 11 plus exam. Quite often we'll come across lots of questions with exactly the same question wording, but whatever's going on here underneath changes in each question, and we need to figure out exactly what's happening in each particular question. So we don't actually need to spend time reading the question text over and over again. Anyway, have a go at this one, and I'm going to leave a poll once again, answer options A to E, and I'll leave a few seconds for everybody to have a go as well. Also, Gayatri, I don't know if you've seen the message in chat, but I do apologize. We've been actually having issues with signing in on the PC. So I hope it's okay that for this session, you join us on the phone, and we'll try and get this sorted out as quickly as possible. Thank you so much. Okay, so a few answers have started coming in for this one as well. Now, this is a rather interesting question. There's a few different elements to it, so I'll leave a few more seconds in case anybody else wants to have a go. And remember, these are tricky questions. So if we get them wrong, there's nothing wrong with that. But we'll look at how to get them right so that we get it right next time we see a question just like this. Okay, so let's have a look at this question. A few of the responses we've got through are option A and option C. So write those down, and I will end the poll. Okay, so let's figure out what's happening here. The first thing we can notice in each box within the sequence is that we have a big circle in the middle of each box, or of each diagram that we've been given. But we also notice that in the first diagram, the big circle is white. In the second diagram, the big circle is gray. In the third diagram, the big circle is white again. We obviously don't know what would happen to the big circle in the fourth diagram. And then in the fifth one, it's white again. So it looks like the pattern that the color of this big circle is following is that it alternates between white and gray. White in the first one, gray in the second, white in the third. So what we expect is a big circle here, which is gray in color. That's the first thing to notice. And this is a good tip for questions like this. You break it up into lots of different manageable chunks. Firstly, by looking at the size and color of the big circle in the middle. We notice the size doesn't change, but the color alternates back and forth between white and gray. The next thing we notice is that in the first diagram, there are 1, 2, 3, 4 black shapes outside the big circle. And these black shapes are all smaller than the size of the big circle. In the second diagram, we notice that one of the shapes, the smallest one, is now inside the big circle, but then 2, 3, and 4 are still outside. In the third figure, what we notice is that 1 and 2 are inside the big circle, but 3 and 4 are still outside. So it looks like more and more of the black shapes are being taken inside the big circle, starting with the smallest, and as we go consequently through our figures, what we would expect to have is the first figure, the first small black figure inside, second one inside too, and here we'd expect the third black figure to be inside as well. But we'd expect the fourth and the largest one to still be outside. Now, the positions of these black figures, aside from being inside or outside the circle, are not really consistent as we go across from left to right. So as long as the three smallest shapes, 1, 2, 3, are inside our gray circle, and the fourth shape is outside, it doesn't exactly matter where they are. And we can see that this pattern is followed in the final figure as well, because we can see the first shape, second shape, third shape, and fourth shape are inside the big circle. So to recap, what we're looking for in our missing figure is a big gray circle with three of the smallest black shapes inside and one black shape that's the largest out of the four black shapes outside. And the one that best describes this is answer option C. I can see why some people went for answer option A, because it looks like 1, 2, 3 shapes are inside, but unfortunately there's actually 2 shapes that are black that are outside the big circle. So we were very close with answer option A, but we just need to be careful in making sure that the number of big black shapes is exactly the same, because that's what we saw in the pattern that we were given. So well done to those of you that said answer option C, and again, unlucky to those of you that said answer option A, but that was about as close as we could get to being right. So here's what we're going to talk about now. We're going to quickly mention some of the things to look out for when we're trying to answer questions that are called complete the sequence, or that give you a sequence to complete. So here are some things to look out for. First thing is, as we go across the sequence, we might see shapes rotating. For example, if we have, let's say, a hexagon in our first box, and then in the second box, we see that it's been rotated, such that we now have a pointy edge at the top rather than one here and one here. It's the same shape, it's just been rotated. This is something that we can often see, and we might notice that the rotation occurs over much larger steps. So we might notice that in the first box, for example, we've got a triangle with one of its edges pointing up. Then maybe it rotates just a tiny little bit clockwise in the second box. Then in the third box, it rotates a bit more. And then in the fourth box, it continues rotating and so on. We need to look out for rotating shapes. Another thing we might notice is reflected shapes. So for example, if we've got a rather unusual looking shape, let's say something like this, a sideways top hat in the first box, and then maybe in the second shape, it's reflected this way. This is something we need to keep an eye out for. We're not going to be told that the shape is reflected. We need to try and notice that. As we've already seen, we also need to look out for changes in shading. We saw earlier that the big circle in the last question went from white to gray to white to gray. And we also need to look for shapes or lines being added or removed. So for example, again, let's start with imagining that our first box contains a hexagon, but then maybe the second box contains a hexagon with a missing line. And this line isn't there. We need to start spotting the pattern that maybe in the following box, we'd have to have a hexagon with 2 missing lines. These are some of the things that we need to look out for in complete the sequence questions, but of course, anything could come up as long as there is a pattern that is to be made as we go from left to right. So we've taken a look at complete the sequence questions, which means we're going to now take a look at another question type. It's called complete the grid. Here's what we need to look out for. In complete the grid style questions, we will be given a grid, either a 2x2 grid or a 3x3 grid. And one of the spaces in the grid will be left empty. Once again, what we need to do is to figure out which of our answer options best fits into the grid to complete it in a sensible way. So exactly the same as complete the sequence, we need to figure out what pattern is being created. But this time, we might be seeing patterns going across rows and down columns in a grid. We'll start by looking at an example question. So I'm just going to get that up now. Here is an example question. Now, because we're seeing a complete the grid question for the very first time, I will read out the question and then I'll leave some time for you to all have a go at it. So, what this question says is, given below is a grid with one empty square. Choose the correct figure from the answer options to complete the grid correctly. And of course, once again, we've got these same answer options, A, B, C, D, and E. And we need to figure out which of them best fits into this missing grid space. Here is your poll. I'll leave a few seconds for everybody to have a go, and then we'll look at the solution. Oh, we've already got some answers. Love it. Okay. So we've had a few different answers, or a couple of different answers from a few different people, rather. We've had A and we've had D. I am going to end the poll here so that we can have a look at the answers. Once again, if you're feeling brave, please do type out what you think the answer is in the chat. But what's happening in this particular question is, first of all, in all of the boxes where we do have a diagram, we can see that there are these double-ended black arrows. There's arrows pointing up and down, left and right. And as far as we can tell, the arrows don't actually change. We've got the same arrows in this box here as we did in the one to its left, and this one here. But what is changing this time is the position of this little white circle. In the first box, or the top left box, it's touching the tip of the arrow pointing left. Then, in the top right box, it's touching the tip of the arrow pointing up. In the bottom left box, it's touching the tip of the arrow pointing right, which means the only one missing, if we imagine that we've got our double-ended black arrows pointing left, right, and up, down, the only one missing is when the circle is touching the tip of the arrow pointing down. Now, there's a couple of ways to understand this. One, which I've already mentioned, which is to imagine that we're trying to figure out what's missing. But we can also notice a pattern if we go down columns. In the first column, we notice that originally our circle was touching the leftward pointing arrow. And then as we went down to the next box, it is now touching the arrow pointing in the opposite direction, to the right. And similarly, if we go down this column, the circle was originally touching the arrow pointing upwards. So following the same pattern, it should now be touching the arrow pointing in the opposite direction, downwards. So out of the answer options that we've been given, the one that looks like it has the complete arrows pointing up, down, and left, right, and has a white circle touching the arrow pointing downwards is answer option A. I can see why some people said D, but unfortunately, the arrow here has been cut off, whereas in all other cases, we had a complete arrow with a downward pointing tip as well. So well done to those of you that said A. Let's take a look at another question of a similar type. Keep note, by the way, that in this question, we saw a 2x2 grid. So that means that's 2 boxes as we go across, 1, 2, and 2 boxes going down as well. 1, 2, 1, 2. I'm going to clear the screen here, and we're going to take a look at the next question. Here we go. So now I'll mention very quickly that the question text, once again, is the same as it was before. It just says, given below is a grid with one empty square. Choose the correct figure from the answer options to complete the grid correctly. This one's a bit more involved, so I'll give you some time to think about it. Remember, there's no rush with these questions as well. Well done to those of you that have already got an answer in. Very, very fast, lightning quick. And as we try more and more of these questions, we'll get better at answering them quickly. In the real exams, in many cases, we'll have only up to 30 seconds to answer these questions. So we'll have 30 seconds to answer each question. But that's not the case right now. Because we're seeing these questions for the first time, sometimes it might take us a little bit longer, and that's okay. And to those of you that are already answering very quickly, well done. So we've had a few answers in already. We've had 4 answers in, and everyone so far is saying answer option A. I'll leave a couple more seconds in case anybody else wants to answer as well. Okay, so let's have a look at this type of question. So now what we notice is that we actually have a 3x3 grid. So that's 3 rows, 3 columns, whereas earlier we saw a 2x2. Doesn't matter though, we use the same logic as we did earlier. Let's start by looking across a single row. Now, unfortunately, the one I've picked is the one that has a missing square as well, but let's start by looking there anyway. What we notice, first of all, is that we've got a circle in the first box, and we've got, well, 3 triangles, but let's focus on the shape for now. We've got a triangle in the second box, and we don't know what shape we'll end up having in the empty box. Now, let's look across the second row. We notice that we've got, well, 3 pentagons, but again, we're focusing on the shape for now. So we've got pentagons in this box. And then we've got circles again, and we've got triangles. And then in the third row, we've got triangles, pentagons, and circles. Now, let's take a look at the number of shapes in each box. So I'll erase this so that we can see exactly what we're doing. And then we'll use a different colored pen. So going across this row once again, we notice that there's only 1 circle in this box. Whereas in the second box, we've actually got 3 nested triangles. So we've got 3 triangles. The biggest one is this one here. And then we've got a slightly smaller triangle inside it and another smaller triangle inside it. So we also don't know how many shapes we expect to see in the empty box because that's what we're trying to work out. Going across the second row, we notice that there's actually 3 pentagons. They're all nested inside each other once again. So we've got the biggest pentagon, and then inside it, we've got a smaller one. And inside that, we've got an even smaller one. Then in the second box, we've got 2 circles, one inside another, and then 1 triangle. In the third row, 2 triangles, 1 pentagon, 3 circles. So if we look carefully, we don't notice that there's a link between how many shapes there are and what shape it is in a particular box. But what we do notice in the rows that are complete, that we always have, I use a different color, that we always have a pentagon, a circle, and a triangle, and we always have 3 shapes, 2 shapes, and 1 shape. Not necessarily in that order, because if we look at the third row, we notice that there's also a triangle in one of the boxes, pentagon in the other, and circle in the final one. And once again, we have 2 shapes, 1 shape, 3 shapes. So to fill the pattern that we've got going on here in our empty box, we need to have 2 shapes because we've got 1 and we've got 3, but we don't have 2 yet. And we've got a circle and a triangle, but we don't have pentagons yet. So what we're looking for is 1 pentagon and a nested pentagon inside. And because in all of the other boxes, they look like regular polygons, we're looking for 2 nested regular polygons. The answer option that best describes this is, of course, answer option A. So well done to those of you that got that right. But we still wanted to have a look at the technique for working out the right answer. Looking across rows is a good idea. We'll notice that if we look down columns, you'll also see a similar pattern. And the keen ones in this, the ones with a keen eye in this group will have realized that if you go across here, you see circles, here are triangles, here are pentagons, here's a triangle. So this should have been a pentagon as well. However, in general cases, the best idea is to go across rows and down columns and to spot patterns that way. So we're going to take a look at another question now. Have a go at this question. Here is your poll. Once we've answered this question, we'll also take a look at some of the most common features that we notice in complete the grid questions, or things to look out for when we're trying to answer complete the grid questions. So we had a couple of answers come in. I'll leave a few more seconds for anybody else that wants to answer too. Okay, so looks like everybody agrees that it's option C. So I'll end it here. So once again, here's what we're looking for. We realize that this is the empty space. So if we go across the first row, we notice there's always a gray arrow pointing to the right. Across the second row, there's always a gray arrow pointing left, which means that across a row, the arrows will always point in the same direction. So across this row, we see that there's an upward pointing arrow and an upward pointing arrow, which means we expect an upward pointing gray arrow in this box as well. Next, we can look at what the black circles are doing. Now, there's a couple of different ways, again, to address this. One of which is to look across rows again, and we'd notice a pattern that says black circle starts on the left, goes to the middle in the middle box, and then goes to the right of the arrow in the third box. But an even easier pattern to notice is when we go down columns. Because down, let's say, the second column, the circle is always above whichever arrow is in that box with it. Same in this column. The circle is to the right, always, of the arrow that is in the same box as it. Which means that in the first column, we expect there to be a circle to the left of the arrow here. And of course, the color of the circle doesn't actually change. So what we're looking for is an answer option with an upward pointing arrow that's gray and a circle that is black to its left. And that is indeed answer option C, as you all identified. So well done to those of you that said answer option C. Let's quickly take a look at some of the things to look out for when we're answering complete the grid style questions. As we've already mentioned, if we have a grid, let's say a 3x3, so I'll draw this out. What we want to start by looking out for is patterns across rows. So we want to see how the diagrams change as we go from, let's say, this box to this box to this box, and how a similar pattern may be formed if we go across these boxes and these boxes. And it doesn't matter which box is missing. We should be able to work out what the correct answer is, regardless of which box does not have a diagram in it. Similarly, we've seen we should look at patterns down columns. So what's happening in this box compared to this box compared to this box, and how does that link to what's happening as we go down this column or indeed this column. Similar to complete the sequence questions we looked at earlier, we also want to look at shapes changing orientation or location. So for example, get rid of some of this stuff. We might have been given a triangle in this first box that's slightly rotated clockwise in the second box and slightly rotated again in the third box. Well, we notice that as we go from left to right, the triangle rotates a little bit. And ideally, the figure will be clear enough that we can work out exactly how much it's rotated by. And we'd maybe spot a similar pattern, let's say, in the next row here. where what would have happened is this square starts out by rotating a little bit so that it rotates clockwise in the same way as the triangles in the first row. And we also want to look at reflections of shape. So we've looked at shapes changing orientation, which sort of links to rotation of shapes, but changing orientation can be in any direction. And shapes can also change locations. So we might notice, for example, that we've got, let's say, a circle in the top left box that's in this corner, but then it moves to the middle here, and then it moves to the top right here. It's very similar to what we saw in the previous question. And we also want to think about reflections of shapes. Once again, we looked at that earlier. So imagine we had our little sideways top hat, and then it's reflected, and maybe it gets reflected back. We want to notice that shapes may have been reflected. Indeed, this particular one could be a rotation as well, but other shapes might be a bit more complicated that allow you to work out that this was a reflection. And finally, we want to look at changes in shading or line style. So we might notice that shapes change color gradually as we go from left to right or top to bottom. Or we might notice that maybe in the first box, let's say we had a circle made up of dots, and then in the second one, it's made up of dashed lines, and in the third one, it's solid. We want to look out for changes in line style as well. These are just some of the things to look out for in Complete the Grid questions. Now, let's take a look at another question type. So I'm going to pull that up here. This final question type that we'll look at today is called similar figures. Excuse me. In this question type, we're going to be given either 2 or 3 figures in our question. And these 2 or 3 figures are somewhat similar to each other. We need to try and work out how they're similar to each other. And crucially, we need to ignore the ways in which they're different to each other. But most importantly, what we need to do is to figure out which of the answer options is most similar to our given figures. Now, we have to not only figure out what's similar between the 2 given figures, but figure out which of the answer options is most similar to those. Now, that sounds a bit confusing, so let's take a look at an example. And as always, because we're looking at a new question type, I'll start by reading out the question, and then I'll give you some time to think about it and to figure out what the answer is in each case. Here is the question. It reads, choose the figure from the answer options that is most like the 2 figures given. So this is the first given figure, and this is the second given figure. And as always, we have our answer options A, B, C, D, and E. Here is our poll. Give everyone a few seconds to think about it. Have a go at this one. It's a tricky one. I can see that everyone's thinking about it. Okay, a couple more answers. Okay. So we've had a C, we've had a D, and we've had an E as well. So let's take a look. Let's take a look at this particular question because, like I said, this is a tricky one. So what's happening, first of all? Well, the strategy that I really like to use in questions like this, where we have to figure out which of the answer options is most similar to our 2 given figures, is to first figure out what's similar between our 2 given figures. So let's start by looking at these 2 figures. The first thing we probably notice is that both of them contain a big white triangle. Here's our big white triangle. They don't necessarily have the same orientation, or they don't even have to be the same type of triangle. We don't have 2 equilateral or 2 isosceles, but they're 2 big white triangles. So I'm going to make a note of that. 2 big white triangles. Next thing I want us to notice is that there's shapes inside and outside, in some cases, the two triangles that we've been given, or the two figures that we've been given. So looking at the first figure, we notice first of all that there's also a little white triangle inside. And if we look at the other figure that we've been given, there's also a little white triangle inside the big white triangle. So that's similar across the two shapes. In fact, I'm going to slightly change what I wrote here. And I'm going to say that for each figure, we want one big white triangle. So this figure has one big white triangle and this figure has one big white triangle. Because then I can write a similar thing for the little white triangles inside. We can say that there's one little white triangle. Sorry, I'm going to write this a little bit higher up because there's another thing we'll need to write shortly as well. One little white triangle inside the big white triangle. And I'm going to represent that using blue because that's what we've used to talk about the size of the big white triangle. Now let's also take notice of the fact that inside each of the figures, so let's start with this one, we've got a little black circle inside the big white triangle. So one little black circle inside, once again, the big white triangle. Then we can take a look at some of the other features. Now, in the first figure, we notice that there's a black circle outside the big white triangle. But in the second figure, we don't have a black circle outside the big white triangle. And similarly, in the second figure, we notice that there's a white circle, a little white circle inside. But we don't have a little white circle inside the first white triangle. So these are not things that are similar across the two figures we've been given. So in this type of question, we actually want to ignore that because what we're looking for as part of the answer to this question is which of the answer options is most like the two figures given. So ideally, the figure that we're looking for would have these three properties. And if it doesn't have all three properties, ideally it would have at least a couple because that's how we'll decide which one is most similar. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to create a little table. And you can do this in your head, but it always helps to write stuff out clearly and concisely. So I'm going to say that for answer option, that's not where I meant to put it. Add an extra line. So answer option A, B, C, D, and E. Here are my boxes. And I'm just going to say if each answer option has exactly what I'm looking for. So let's start with big white triangle for answer options A, B, C, D, and E. Answer option A indeed does have a big white triangle. So I'm going to say tick. It has a big white triangle. Answer option B doesn't. It has a four-sided shape. Triangles are three-sided shapes. So the big white shape in answer option B isn't what we're looking for. So it doesn't have a big white triangle. Answer option C, once again, does have a big white triangle. Tick. Same with answer option D. Tick. And answer option E. Tick once again. Now let's take a look at what's happening with the little white triangle inside the big white one. Answer option A. Well, we've got this little white triangle, but it's not entirely inside the big white triangle. So if we're unsure, we do have a little white triangle, but we probably want it to be inside the big white triangle. If we're unsure, let's leave a question mark because it's not entirely inside, which is what we're looking for. But maybe that's enough. We don't yet know. Answer option B does have a little white triangle inside the big white shape. So we're going to put a tick there even though we saw that this wasn't actually a big white triangle, but never mind. Still put a tick for the fact that there's a little white triangle inside the big shape. Now onto option C. Unfortunately, I've drawn all over it, but the triangle is inside the big white triangle, so tick there. And similarly with answer option D, even though this corner here is touching the base of our triangle, the little white triangle is inside the big one. And finally, with answer option E, we do have a triangle, but it's black. So we're going to say there's definitely not a little white triangle inside our big white one. And finally, you know the drill by now. What we're going to do is to look at the one little black circle inside the big white triangle. Answer option A has one, tick. Answer option B has one, tick. Answer option C doesn't have one inside the big white triangle, cross. And it's not even crossing over like we saw with this triangle earlier. Answer option D does have a little black circle inside. Once again, I've drawn over it slightly, so it might not be super clear, but it is inside entirely. And answer option E does have a little black circle inside. So now that we've completed this table, we're simply looking for the shape that ideally has all of these properties that we listed. One big white triangle, one little white triangle inside the big white triangle, and one little black circle inside the big white triangle. And that looks like answer option D. So this is the one that we're looking for. And those of you that said D, well done. This was a really difficult question. Really, really tough. So, this is how we break things down. We look at it chunk by chunk by looking at it shape by shape, for example. We figure out what's similar between these different shapes. And then, if we can, we make a table about it, but we try and figure out which of the answer options is the most similar. Another thing worth noting is that in this particular question, we saw that there were only two given figures, 1 and 2. But we may notice in some of our 11 plus exams that certain questions give us 3 figures to figure out what's similar between them, and then 5 answer options to figure out which is the most similar to those. Let's take a quick look at another example question. So let's go with this one here. Now remember, the question text is exactly the same as it was earlier. Choose the figure from the answer options that is most like, but this time it says the 3 figures given, because now we do have 3 figures, 1, 2, 3. And we've purposefully included some of the most tricky questions at the end, but I am going to give you some time once again to have a think about this and see if you can figure out which is the answer option. So here is your poll. So for anybody trying to join this session, by the way, I know we're nearly at the end, but anybody trying to join on PC or OS, on computer, basically, we'd love some more details in chat if possible to figure out what was going wrong, because it looks like it should be up and running at this point. And please do let us know if there's anything we can do to help. Okay, we've had a few answers in. So a lot of people are saying B, and we've also had D in the answer options. I'm going to end the poll here. And I think many of you have spotted the trick here. So what's happening with this question is initially very difficult to notice. But actually, if we look at the 3 given figures, we need to try and spot what's similar across them. Sometimes it also helps to look at what's going on in the answer options, by the way, to try and figure out what's going on here, because the figures that have been given to us, the 3 figures at the top of the screen, can sometimes look like they're, just blended into each other. There's lots of different shapes maybe, and we don't know exactly what they look like. We might think, for example, that the first shape is made up of 2 arrows pointing this way and then 2 arrows pointing this way. But really, the pattern that we're looking for is this here. We need to notice that the first figure is made up of hexagons. Here's one regular hexagon, which means that all of the sides are the same length as each other. Here is our next hexagon. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sides. And here is our third hexagon. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sides. Really tricky to notice, but once you do, you can apply this to the other figures as well. This time we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8-sided shapes, octagons that are overlapping each other. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And I'm going to go with pink for the third one because that's what I did earlier. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And let's use green. Why not? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now, if we've noticed this pattern for the first 2 figures, then we might think of initially that this shape is made up of 3 rectangles. But actually, in this particular question, what we need it to be made up of is 2 squares. Because remember, squares are regular polygons. They've got the same number of sides. Oh, sorry. The side lengths are all the same as each other, which means that this side is the same length as this side, is the same as this side, is the same as this side. So that's the first thing we need to notice. We need to notice that this shape is made up of overlapping regular polygons. The next thing we need to notice is that the first one is made up of hexagons, which each have 6 sides. This one has octagons, which, as we saw earlier, each have 8 sides. And this one is made up of squares. And we may know that squares are made up of 4 sides. Finally, we need to notice that the first figure is made up of 3 overlapping hexagons. 1, 2, 3. The blue one, the pink one, and the orange one. Or the blue one, the orange one, and the pink one, if we're going in the order that I drew them in. Let's quickly replenish that. The second figure is made up of 4 overlapping octagons. The blue one, the orange one, the pink one, and the green one. And the square, the third figure is made up of 2 overlapping squares. So the pattern we need to notice here, which is actually quite detailed, is that this number here, the number of shapes overlapping, is half of the number of sides of each shape. So hexagons are 6-sided. 6 is equal to 3 times 2, and we've got 3 hexagons overlapping. Octagons are 8-sided. 8 is equal to 4 times 2, and we've got 4 overlapping octagons. Squares are made up of 4 sides. It's equal to 2 times 2, and we've got 2 overlapping squares. So what we're looking for in our answer options is a figure that has a certain number of overlapping shapes, such that the number of overlapping shapes is exactly half that of the number of sides of each shape. Now, many of you have identified options B and D, so let's take a look at those first. With answer option B, what we've got is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10-sided shapes. Decagons. I'm going to say 10-sided because that's the important thing here. 10-sided shapes, which means we want 5 of them overlapping each other. A really easy way to notice how many are overlapping, because it can be a bit confusing, they're all jumbled up together, is to pick one point on, let's say, this decagon, the one that points to the left, and then count how many of those there are as we go from left to right. So that's 1, and we've got 2, 3, 4 here hidden away, and we've got 5. And as we move further to the right, or anything that we feel like might be an edge piece or a corner that we're looking for, we notice is actually pointing to the right. So that's the right side of the decagon. That's not what we're looking for. So in reality, we do have 5 decagons that are 10-sided overlapping each other. So this might be the right answer. In answer option D, we notice that it's made up of overlapping triangles. 1, 2, 3 triangles. So we've got 3-sided shapes, and we've got 3 of them overlapping each other. This unfortunately doesn't follow the rule that we wanted. We wanted this number here, the number of overlapping shapes, to be half that of the number of sides of each shape. And if we go through all the other answer options, we notice that none of those work as well. Here we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pentagons, so that doesn't work. Here we've got 1, 2, 3 shapes that are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 sided, so that doesn't work. And this one's got way too many sides to just be made up of 1, 2, 3, 4 overlapping shapes. They're certainly not decagons. They're certainly not octagons. We know what octagons look like already. So here's what we need to think about. We need to figure out, first of all, what the pattern is commonly shared across the figures that have been given to us, and then figure out which of the answer options is the one that most closely resembles what we're looking for. And in this case, it was answer option B. So well done to those of you that said that. Let's now finish up. Let's now summarize this session very quickly. So what we've looked at in this session are 3 different types of questions that may come up in your non-verbal reasoning exam as part of year 11+. We saw complete the sequence, complete the grid, and similar figures. And we've looked at a few different questions in each case, as well as a few different tips and tricks to answer these questions. In the next session, exactly this time next week, 5 p.m. on Tuesday, we'll be looking at 3 more question types that are likely to come up in your 11+ non-verbal reasoning exam. Please also do take a look at your Nagwa Classes app. Have a look at the homework page. There'll be some questions for you to have a go at. That will be specifically of the types that we've looked at so far. And also you'll be able to leave some chat messages between sessions in case you've got any questions that you didn't want to ask during the session. So we'll be taking a look at that as well. I'm going to clear the screen here. And the last thing I'm going to say is thank you very much for joining, and we will see you next week.